All right, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, and it's a great venue. It's been wonderful. So, as said, I'm going to talk about about my book, Cedar Mountain and Antietam. We'll talk about the first half of the book this evening, getting up through the end of the Northern Virginia campaign, second half. All right, so we're talking about the Second Corps Army of Virginia. It will become the 12th Corps Army of the Potomac. And the Army of Virginia was formed June 26, 1862. It was the same day that Mechanicsville was happening down in the peninsula, right down there. And the commander, Major General John Pope, he had success out in the Western Theater at Island Number 10 in New Madrid, and so they brought him east to bring some coordination to the three units that had been operating independently and not very effectively in the spring of 1862 against Stonewall Jackson in the Valley. So the first of those units was become the First Corps Army of Virginia. Franz Sigel is the commander of that unit. It had been under John C. Fremont in the Valley, and it will become the 11th Corps Army of Potomac. And they were positioned at Sperryville. And just give you some orientation here. There's the Rapidan, there's Rappahannock, Fredericksburg. The Third Corps Army of Virginia was under Irving McDowell, and they would become the First Corps Army of the Potomac before too long. And they were positioned, they had two divisions. One was at Waterloo Bridge, the other one in Fredericksburg. Second Corps Army of Virginia, our topic this evening, is commanded by Nathaniel Prentice Banks. They were placed at Little Washington. Banks was a political general. He had been the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was also Governor of Massachusetts for a time. He had been a know-nothing politician and then became a Republican. His political connections allowed him to become one of the highest-ranking major generals in the Army without really having any experience. So I'll talk briefly here about John Pope's intentions. He has explained it to his commanders. He wanted to be able to concentrate his forces within 24 hours in order to either threaten the rail hub at Gordonsville here, which was an important supply route for the Army of Northern Virginia, right around Richmond, or to concentrate to go into the flank of a Confederate move towards Fredericksburg, if that were to happen. Basically, he's trying to guard the capital, Washington, and also put pressure on Lee, take some pressure off of McClellan. And while he was talking to Banks, a few of his personal communications with him were pretty interesting, because he told the whole army about the spirit of aggressiveness that he wanted, that he was going to bring from the West. And a lot of folks are familiar with that, but personally to Nathaniel Banks, he was telling him things like, okay, we're going to attack, I need you to do this. And he was sort of invoking the experience Nathaniel Banks had after First Winchester, where they pulled out of Staunton and then fought Winchester, and then there's this sort of skedaddle back towards Williamsport. And that was sort of weighing on Nathaniel Banks' mind. So, as I said, the Corps collected at Little Washington. This Edwin Forbes drawing is great. It is of a grand review that happened on July 28th at Little Washington. The Corps was collecting in sort of dribs and drabs between July 17th, July 19th. They were doing a lot of drill in the 60-acre drill field, and there's quite a lot of detail about this event. But at the end of this large drill maneuver, all the regiments formed hollow squares, and Banks' cavalry guard charged each of the squares. So, it's not quite Waterloo, but it's kind of interesting. And then you have Banks and staff here. This is Edwin Forbes again. So I'll talk about the brigade division commanders very briefly. We're going to talk a little bit more about the 1st Division tonight, so that's where I'll put more of my time right now. 1st Division was commanded by Alpheus Williams. If anybody knows anything about him, he didn't make Major General until the very end of the war. He was sort of bitter about that. You can see that in his letters. But he was a steady, largely dependable general. And he was a 1831 Yale law school grad. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Mexican War in the Michigan Regiment, and basically he moved to Michigan after the Mexican War. His first brigade commander was Samuel Wiley Crawford. Crawford was an 1846 Penn Medical School graduate. He served as an Army surgeon in the out west and on the frontier, basically the whole way up until the beginning of the war. At 1860, he took a really fortuitous billet for him at Fort Moultrie, and when that garrison repaired to Fort Sumter, he first joined it, and he volunteered to be a battery commander at Sumter. And as with most things at the very beginning of the war, he got a lot of notoriety for not doing a whole lot. He switched to the infantry, took a major's commission in the 13th U.S. Infantry, and was on Rosecrans' staff in Western Virginia until through the fall of 61, early spring of 62. And he then transferred into Nathaniel Banks's command just in time for Winchester. He was there as a supernumerary, had no real responsibilities, but Banks was satisfied with the service that he rendered. And so he, very soon after Winchester, he supplanted the brigade commander, Colonel Dudley Donnelly of the 28th New York. Donnelly was well liked. He was a pretty good regimental commander. He went back to the 28th New York. The 3rd Brigade commander, there was no 2nd Brigade at the time, was George Henry Gordon. Gordon was an 1846 West Point graduate, a famous class: Stonewall Jackson, McClellan, Jesse Reno, a handful of other well-known folks. He served in the Dragoons under Bull Sumner and fought in the Mexican War. He was brevetted twice, wounded twice during the Mexican War. He fought hand-to-hand against a pair of Mexican guerrillas on a bridge during the Mexican War. And then after the war, he did some kind of standard frontier duty until 1854, and then resigned his commission, went to Harvard Law, and practiced in Boston until the outset of the war. He got the permission of Governor Andrew in Massachusetts and the president to form the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry, sort of in the image that he wanted, and he got some dispensation to do things a little bit differently than most folks do. The regiment had a really good reputation for being disciplined, and then when he took over this brigade, it did as well. He wasn't he had some trouble though with relationships. He didn't suffer people he thought were kind of fools. He thought that of Nathaniel Banks. They did not get along. They had some fairly heated run-ins. And then the 27th Indiana of his brigade didn't like him very much either. They thought it would have been better at a stalking pestilence visited the regiment than him. But they did recognize he knew what he was doing. If I had to come up with an analog for Gordon in the Civil War, it would be D.H. Hill, who kind of knew his business but was kind of prickly. And it didn't help Gordon's career any better than it did D.H. Hill. Okay, in the 2nd Division, you have Christopher Auger, John Geary, Henry Prince, and George Sears Green. Every one of them but Geary was a West Pointer. Every one of them but Green had served in the Mexican War. Prince was severely wounded in the Mexican War. He also was in the Seminole War and the Utah War on either side of it. We're not going to focus too much on this lot, but I will say, of the whole Corps, the only units that had been in any fights where they had any kind of success, a major pitched battle where they had any success, were these Ohio regiments and Geary's brigade. The rest of this division, for the most part, had not been in any major battles at all. A lot of railroad The 1st Division were the ones at 1st Winchester, and that didn't go well. All right. So when the Corps was making its way to Little Washington, 2 regiments of Crawford's brigade under Dudley Donnelly made their way to Culpeper, and they joined Brigadier General John Hatch with the Corps Cavalry Brigade. And Hatch had received orders, initially it's from Pope, filtered down to Hatch to go on a cavalry raid to Gordonsville. He's supposed to do this on the 14th, and he's supposed to tear up the track from Gordonsville eastward. And once he had done that, he's supposed to continue to Charlottesville, and then do the same thing there, and then continue to Lynchburg and destroy a canal down there. So Hatch had the bright idea of, after getting delayed a little bit in starting, to take Donnelly's 2 infantry regiments with him on his cavalry raid. And it went, as you might expect, very poorly. The roads were already very bad because of the rain that had been going on, but the progress was quite slow. And what ended up happening was Stonewall Jackson with his former division and Richard Ewell with his division showed up on the 15th at Gordonsville on the tracks that Hatch was supposed to have destroyed. So a few days into this expedition, Pope discovers, it takes that long for him to figure out how far behind he is, that he has infantry with him, and he was furious. They all make it back to Culpeper on the 21st, and then Pope sends Hatch out on another expedition that also fails. He then has had enough with Hatch, removes him from that position, and puts him in a brigade in Irvin McDowell's Corps, which is where he'll be going into the Maryland campaign, and you'll see him at South Mountain. But what Pope does do, which is a really great thing in Pope's military historical record, is he pulls John Buford out of the Inspector General's office, who's a major at the time, and puts him in charge of that brigade and sets him on the course to doing great things at Gettysburg. And so Pope's getting increasingly in the late days of July impatient about the situation at the front at Culpeper. And he keeps asking Nathaniel Banks at Little Washington questions. He starts coaching him and giving him more and more direction. That eventually rolls downhill to Crawford. Banks starts coaching Crawford and trying to figure out what's happening. He eventually sends a trusted colonel, I forgot to show him to you on the picture, but John S. Clark, basically an intelligence chief for Banks, and he does a lot of great things over the course of this narrative. But he sends him down there, and basically he's Banks' eyes and ears, and eventually Crawford gets it in his head that he's I'm gonna go do something now. And so he goes on a cavalry raid across the Rapidan with a couple of cavalry regiments, and they get into a fight at Orange Courthouse with the 7th Virginia Cavalry. And they get the better of the Virginians. I'm not going to talk about it tonight, though. So they collect some prisoners, get some intelligence. Pope decides to start concentrating, and he has orders for different elements to start moving on August 6th. And he has Banks head to Culpeper. The balance of Crawford's brigade had already gone down there on July 24th. Banks is supposed to go, and then Sigel is supposed to follow Banks a day later. He ends up wasting a lot of time trying to figure out what road he's supposed to go on. Pope does not understand that because there's one macadamized road that's a direct route, and he's kind of frustrated why Sigel doesn't realize where he's supposed to go. But he gets there too late to participate in Cedar Mountain. And Rickett's division is also supposed to go to Culpeper. So they begin their movement. It takes 2 days to get to Culpeper. And on August 7th, Stonewall Jackson begins to move. By this time, A.P. Hill's division had joined him as well. So they make very slow progress. It's not just the mid-90s heat and over 100 heat index that's slowing the Confederates down, though. In fact, some Union troops die on this march because of the heat. But there's a misunderstanding of orders. So on August 8th, the second day of marching for the Confederates, A.P. Hill is supposed to be waiting in Orange Courthouse, and when Ewell's division goes by, he's supposed to follow him and continue on up towards Culpeper, which is the objective for the Confederates. And Ewell gets orders to go by a different route, and nobody tells A.P. Hill. And so A.P. Hill's standing there in the square in Culpeper, waiting. Eventually Jackson's division shows up and goes through. Jackson's trains go through, or the division trains go through, and then A.P. Hill follows. And of course that's going to slow him down a lot. And this sets these two generals' relationship off on a really wrong foot, and it doesn't really recover. One other thing that happens is, so Jackson doesn't like his cavalry commander, Beverly Robertson, very much, but he actually somehow does something very good here. He's covering the left flank of Ewell's division, and he somehow convinces Buford up here at Madison Courthouse that the main thrust is going in that direction. And Buford begins sending a lot of messages suggesting as much. And that has an interesting consequence, because the road up through Madison Courthouse then continues on through James City and around over here to Colvin's Tavern. And we'll see that some more here in a moment. So here's that road coming to Colvin's Tavern. And so what ends up happening is, when Ricketts comes down, his division gets posted right there, and that's sort of a defensive mechanism against getting outflanked by Stonewall Jackson, and these troops don't participate in the battle, to the great ire of Banks' Corps marching past them all day and then not seeing them participate in the battle later when after it goes quite badly. And so Ricketts is there. Crawford had gone down on the 8th. As things started, the Confederates made it across the river. Orders were for Crawford to go down and join George Baird's cavalry brigade of Urban McDowell's Corps, and who's doing a holding action against Jackson's people. Here's Crawford's brigade, and the next morning, after all these messages from John Buford, the Corps heads down to join them. And 1st Division, really all that's left is Gordon is first. Gordon gets down here, he's looking at the ground, and he sees some high ground over here, where this brown cottage is. And there's a sort of plenipotentiary for John Pope on the site, and it's Benjamin Roberts, Brigadier General. And Gordon sees Roberts, and he says, well, I think it would be a fine thing for us to put our brigade and anchor our right over there in that high ground. And Roberts agrees with him, and Gordon sets off over to that ground. The problem is that nobody ever tells Nathaniel Banks this, and Banks has this misapprehension about where his right is. He thinks he's much closer where Crawford ends up being. So, and then one other thing that happens is there's a signal station here on Thoroughfare Mountain. They are signaling back to the main army and saying there's Confederate cavalry threatening them. The result of that is the 28th Pennsylvania. They've been in some skirmishes, but no major battles, and they're an unusually large regiment at 15 companies, so they're quite large. Part of Geary's brigade, and they could have been well utilized at this battle, but they end up going on alone and unafraid over Thoroughfare Mountain and occupy it. So they're out of battle. And then also, so Robertson and Baird are standing off. Early shows up, and he pushes Baird off the field. What he does then is occupy this ground just in front of Crittenden Lane. I'll give you some geography of this field really quickly. So you have the Crittenden Lane here, Mitchell Station Road. They're both on ridges, and it's lower ground in between because of this rivulet. And you have a series of cornfields in between as well. Here's Cedar Run, and Cedar Mountain's here. A really slaughtered mountain is what it was called back then. More of Cedar Run going out this way. Orange, Culpeper Road, it's more or less a north-south road, but here it turns almost east-west. And you have a lot of woods on the north side of the road, and cut out of that woods are wheat field, and then forming a backward L, what I call a scrub field, a lot of people call it a brushy field, basically a bunch of brushes and things, new growth about this tall, well, waist to here. So when the unit starts showing up, as I said, early takes position here, and then the rest of Ewell's division's up on the mountain with some batteries, and they have some batteries here. When Jackson's division shows up, Tullifer lines up here, and Thomas Garnett, in an unfortunate position, or disposition, lines up north of the road. You have the Stonewall Brigade under Charles Ronald here, and they're basically standing by. On the Union side, the Crawford's Brigade moves entirely to the north side of the road, and then the 2nd Division fills in down here. Geary, Prince, Green, a very small brigade, and Gordon's up here. So an artillery duel kicks off at roughly 4 o'clock. The Confederates are outnumbered a bit, but they get the better of this because they're on much better position, and they get there's a lot of plunging fire, and the Federal artillery doesn't have a good day. And result of this artillery barrage, though, is the commander of the Stonewall Division, Charles Winder, takes a ball through his torso, and he expires pretty quickly, but he's out of this fight. William Tullifer takes over. His relative, Alexander Galt Tullifer, takes over the brigade. But Tullifer, sort of defensive mindset, and he also doesn't know what the plan was. Jackson doesn't really share much anyway, but Winder didn't have an opportunity to explain anything to him either. So what Tullifer starts doing is thinking defensively, and he's concerned about his left here. So he sends his own 10th Virginia looking for Garnett's left, and he sends the Stonewall Brigade looking for his left. They kind of meandering through some very thick woods, and it takes them a little bit too long to get there. All right, so the units move into position. Actually, really quickly. Geary moves his units forward into the wheat field, or into the cornfield, excuse me, and Crawford moves to the edge of the wheat field. And there's Crawford and his regimental commanders have this little conference, and there's a lot of animation about some of them think, Crawford and Joseph Knight think they should go forward and capture this battery, and others recognize that they don't really know what's in front of them. Eventually orders come from Banks that he wants in advance, and they will go forward. The Geary advances as well. From the records, it appears that it's supposed to be Crawford first, then Geary, kind of a rolling advance here. Geary actually lands slightly earlier. But so they go forward, and they're fighting with Tullifer and with Garnett. And many of Garnett's people have their attention focused over on Geary. Prince moves his first line forward and then goes back to get his second line. Meanwhile, the very first of A.P. Hill's brigades, which are strung out on the road, Edward Thomas's brigade of Georgians, make it down here. And they drop off the 14th Georgia before they leave to bolster Tullifer, which ends up being really important. So Crawford's people get into the wheat field, bayonets fixed, big hurrah, and they go forward. And they push down here. The 5th Connecticut gets stalled at this rivulet very briefly. But the 28th New York is going forward, and the 1st Virginia Battalion puts 3 ineffective volleys towards the New Yorkers, and after the final one, New Yorkers just push into the woods, and the Virginians fall back. The 46th Pennsylvania runs into the 10th Virginia before they get to where they're trying to go, and the 10th Virginia falls away, and the Pennsylvanians turn into the flank of the 27th Virginia. So after the New Yorkers get into the woods, they swing left, and the 21st Virginia learns of them is when they get a volley in their back at about 30 paces, because they're paying attention over here. and the corn, or the woods west of the wheat field just turned into this really rough hand-to-hand combat. Now, up here, there's something else going on. So Gordon had sent 6 companies of the 6th Wisconsin Forward. All of its field officers were with this detachment, and they are on a wood road here when Crawford makes his first advance towards the wheat field. And the 46th Pennsylvania goes right through Ruger's path, and he gets orders from Crawford saying, okay, you're going to join my advance. And Ruger, future Major General, he's there under Gordon's orders. He tells that to Crawford's aide, basically just telling him to pound sand. Eventually, orders do come from higher authority, and he's told to go forward. What he does is he remembers that the 46th Pennsylvania passed through his lines. He moves himself out to the right to try to uncover, and he ends up here at the edge of the scrub field. Now, the traditional interpretation of this event is that the Stonewall Brigade, when it gets its order to go, it goes forward, wheels to the right, and lines this slight ridge, which is, several accounts say, that slight ridge is the border between the scrub field and the wheat field. And then they lay in to the Federals' flank in the wheat field, and the 3rd Wisconsin just gets mauled, and they go backwards. But if you look at the accounts from the Stonewall Brigade, they basically say, well, we go forward, and there's some unit there in front of us, small unit, we push them aside, and then we wheel right, and then fire into the folks in the wheat field. And that's the 3rd Wisconsin. And in about 2 to 3 minutes, they lose 30% of the folks that they have engaged right there. Now, there are a couple sources that point to this, but the main thing is in Thomas Ruger's official report, he talks about he did a drawing of this action, and the OR doesn't publish it, just says it's just not published. And this is the actual document. I'll bring it back for you. This is the actual document from the National Archives. And so what you see here is a slight ridge, 46th Pennsylvania to the west of it. Here's the edge of the woods. 46th Pennsylvania to the west, 3rd Wisconsin to the east, it's south and north. And this orientation of the enemy is exactly how the Stonewall Brigade describes itself, each of the regimental commanders. And here it is, oriented as it is on the map. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple stories to get at the sort of nature of the fighting here. So in the 28th New York, you have Lieutenant William Warren. He gets out into the wheat field, sees Confederate colors on the other side, wants to encourage his men to go after him, and tells them as much, sword in the air, ball takes off the tip of his right index finger. He goes a little bit further, and another ball hits him below the left elbow. Eventually 13 pieces of bone are taken out of that wound. And goes a little bit farther, and he takes another ball in his head, takes a piece of his skull away, the ball does, and his face is covered in blood. He's blind in one eye, at least temporarily, and continues on. Another ball goes in between his carotid artery and his windpipe, lodges at the base of his skull, and he recollected that it swelled up like a basket. And we'll get to this in a minute, but on the retreat out of here, they're going back through the wheat field, and during that retreat, a 5th ball hits him in the left leg, centered above the knee, and that puts him on the ground. And he stays there like the rest of the wounded for 2 days in the heat that I described earlier, which is quite bad for them. All right, so one of the 20th New York's opponents, the 21st Virginia, who got that volley in their back, after that happened, the woods degenerate into this sort of melee, and they describe clubbed rifles, bayonets, thrown rocks, fence rails, using basically everything they have. And the smoke in the woods is such that Lieutenant Warren told his people to get on the ground and look for legs to shoot above, because it's so thick, the smoke is so thick in the darkening woods, because it's now about 6 o'clock, 6:30, sun's going down. So that's what the scene's like in there. But in the 21st Virginia, there's a private, Roswell Lindsay, and what happens to him is he bayonets a Yankee. He's then shot by several balls, the first of which is from a federal captain, and then that federal captain's bayoneted by several of his comrades in 21st Virginia. So that's sort of the nature of what's happening in the woods there. And then finally, the man pictured here is Captain Moses O'Brien. He's in that detachment with the 3rd Wisconsin. While out there, he's actually, his company's the last one to leave. And then 2.5 of the companies go to this wooded ravine right here and take shelter. And Ruger shows up with more of the men later and joins them, and then the whole brigade comes through and they join them later. But while they're in the woods there, his boot's filling with blood, he's shot in the leg, and so he puts a tourniquet on that, cuts his pants open, puts a tourniquet on him, and he goes back, and when they go back, they go to the wheat field, and he's shot through the body in the wheat field. He's there on the ground for 2 days. When they come back, the 3rd Wisconsin surgeon tells him that it's mortal. His men don't want him riding the ambulance, so they carry him by stretcher back to Culpeper, which is 6-7 miles, and he ends up dying on a hotel porch in Culpeper. All right. So, in Prince's brigade, the 7th Ohio had been getting really the worst of this from Garnett, and they end up falling back kind of fairly early. They're replaced by the 29th Ohio, and the 5th Ohio fills in. On Prince's line, when Prince goes back, brings forward his second line, the 109th Pennsylvania, 102nd New York, he gives them explicit instructions on, okay, you're going to shoot off here 30 degrees to the left and to avoid my first line, even though you're in your echelon, you're going to fire this way. And the 3rd Maryland was convinced that they had gotten fired into their backs by the 109th Pennsylvania, and they soon leave. The 111th Pennsylvania pulls off too, but at that same time, and they sort of fill in here. And meanwhile, Thomas's people are firing down the line of these Federals, picking off federal officers in the 102nd New York from their left to right. Some of them were supposed to be up in trees too. And but not all's kind of well here on the Confederate side. A gunner in one of these Maryland batteries. I'll give you a quote here. He described a rumbled roar and crackling like the noise of a mighty windstorm, smashing and breaking through the woods. That's Crawford's people coming out of the woods. And a rider comes up and tells them to limber the rear. Meanwhile, Jubal Early is down this hillside placing Thomas in what he thinks is a good position. When he doesn't know anything of what's happening up above, and when he gets there, he sees he has the 12th Georgia, a portion of the 52nd Virginia, and the 58th Virginia. Everybody else is gone from there to the woods, like a half a mile away. And so he sends riders off to try to bring people back, and he stays and tries to bolster the people he has left there on the right. Crawford's people had come out of the woods, and they're mostly disorganized by this time. And their physical advance really is probably to about here. But the influence is all the way down here because all these regiments leave. Some of them do better than others because the 13th Virginia and a portion of the 31st Virginia only fall back a little bit, and they get re-engaged in the fight before too long. And that 14th Georgia that I mentioned, they stay kind of put where they are. They waver for a moment, but then they start putting fire into Crawford's flank. You also have A.P. Hill's, more brigades from A.P. Hill showing up. Branch's brigade, as mentioned earlier. They show up, and Branch, in his write-up of the battle, basically suggests they won the whole battle themselves. That's a little bit of a stretch, but they do more than maybe some other folks. So the situation you have here, though, is you have the Stonewall Brigade up here, you have Early's few units down here, and you have this yawning gap in the center of Jackson's line. Things are not looking good, and all that was done by 3 small federal regiments. So, and the problem, though, is that their offensive strength is spent, and they have no support to do anything. So they're moving down here. They're in little squads, basically, by this point, and they're intermixed. So when the 14th Georgia fires into them, that's really the critical moment. They start falling back, and there's a well-known story of Stonewall Jackson. He's kind of in this region when everything's kind of getting loud over in the woods. He moves over that way, tells some batteries to limber, gets into the woods, and there's the story of him putting the sword in the air. It's rusted into a scabbard, and encouraging everybody to join him. Right? Would have been very inspiring for the people in Garnett's brigade that are here, but they don't really do much in the rest of the battle. Portions of them will join other units inspired by Jackson and go off and participate. But as a unit, they're not really a game changer here. It's really 14th Georgia, 13th and 31st Virginia, and then AP Hill's people showing up. So Banks sees things are starting to go poorly because Crawford's people are starting to come back. And I failed to mention earlier that Crawford gave the order to go. Several people mentioned this. He gave the order to go, and then he stayed behind in the woods. And Dudley Donnelly was the de facto brigade commander during this charge. And he's mortally wounded, and pretty much every other field officer actually was mortally wounded or captured. So what Banks tries to do was, actually, I'll say really quickly, 14th Georgia, 13th, 31st Virginia, they move forward and they will end up pushing off Geary's people and then swing this way. And Branch comes down here and lines up against the wheat field. So Banks takes a couple swings. One is he sends orders for Gordon to go forward. Gordon is much farther away than he had anticipated, than Banks had. And Gordon's up there on that high ground at the Brown Cottage with instructions from Alpheus Williams to keep an eye out for Williams to wave a white handkerchief, and then that was their order to go forward and support Crawford's brigade. He never saw that. He's up there with his glasses, and by this time, his men had been kind of relaxing in the trees, or under the trees, because it's such a hot day, and they're trying to cool off. But they're hearing all this going on, and everybody's getting up, and they eventually are formed up before anybody tells them to. And again, this is a quite good brigade, and they're basically ready to go. Gordon's standing there, he's waiting, and eventually a staffer comes up and tells him, okay, you're supposed to go, and they orders they go double quick down the hillside of the, below the Brown Cottage, and then through a kind of marshy portion of Cedar Run, and back up this was pretty steep hills here, scrambling over rocks and brush and things. But it takes them a while to get there. The 10th Maine, part of Crawford's brigade, had been held back as a support for a battery. And that battery eventually moved on, leaving the 10th Maine a sort of de facto bodyguard for Nathaniel Banks. And he sends them forward. So they're going forward by themselves. And they get in the wheat field, and Crawford's people, the rest of Crawford's people, are streaming past them to the rear and saying, there are too many Confederates out there, you've got to get out of here. And about the time they get there, Branch shows up here. They're getting fire from their right, from the Stonewall Brigade. And Colonel George Beale, the commander of that regiment, decides, okay, well, I'm going to do much better if we're at the tree line than if we're out here in the middle of this wheat field. So he starts to move rearward, and a staffer from Nathaniel Banks, Louis Palouse, rides up to him and says, what are you doing? Nobody gave you orders to go to the rear. And Beale tells them basically what he was trying to do. And they have an argument out there. They're under fire. They're having an argument about this. And one of the members of the 10th Maine suggested that it looked like they were having a fist fight out there under fire. And Palouse tells Beale that if you're not going to fight this regiment, I'll do it for you. And Beale refused that kind of offer and said, okay, now I'll take care of it. But they do recover a little bit here too. There's a bit of a ridge about a third of the way through the wheat field. And the men are, on their kneeling or on the ground for the most part. But soon, Archer's brigade shows up and sidles up next to Branch. And so now you have 3 Confederate brigades shooting at this one regiment. And it doesn't take too long for them to head to the rear. And they're really, so the time they're leaving is when Gordon's people, kind of out of breath, make it to the edge of the wheat field. But before they really get engaged, this it's 164 riders from the 1st Pennsylvania Cavalry. They get the order from Banks to charge down the Orange Road, into the wheat field, and straight at Branch's brigade. And by the time that they get there, the 13th Virginia, 31st Virginia, 14th Georgia, all wheel to the left, and now they're lining the edge of the road to shoot right in the side of these riders too. And they actually their officers tell them to hold their fire until they are right there. And so that cavalry charge breaks up and they all head to the rear. And so now what you're left with is Gordon's brigade here at the edge of the wheat field all by itself. And they do pretty well for a moment. Because Archer's people go forward, Branch actually gets direction from Jackson to wheel into the cornfield, and they actually stall Archer in the middle of that wheat field for a little time, especially on the right where the 2nd Massachusetts firing by file, and they stall Archer. But Pender's North Carolinians show up, and a staffer for Charles Ronald moves them around behind the scrub field, and they line up on Gordon's flank, and it's now well after dark, and they just move down Gordon's flank and peel everybody off. And Archer and Pender get mixed up. They don't see Gordon heading back towards the Brown Cottage, and they both kind of go down this way. Meanwhile, Augur's wounded, Geary's wounded, they're both out of the battle. Geary's brigade's gone. Henry Prince is still fighting with his 2nd line down here, and he hears no firing coming from his right, and he goes to look for Augur, and it's dark. He's heading up this way because that's where he thinks he's going to be, and he runs into some Confederates and he gets captured. So now, the whole leadership on the 2nd Division is turning over. But so all these rallying regiments, and now you have Ewell's people coming off the mountain. They push Greene off. These 2 regiments just barely make it out of there in time. That's basically the end of Cedar Mountain. I'm going to take you to a little further on here, but that's the end of this battle for this corps. Some of the other folks we talked about before, they show up. There's a little bit of an artillery duel after dark, kind of late, and the Confederates get the worst of that one. But that's pretty much it. So now, I'm not going to run down all this with you, but those 28th New York numbers are pretty instructive. And the one really important thing that happens here is that you have all this turnover in not just the leadership of the 2nd Division, because you have a full turnover there, but the company commanders, especially in Crawford's brigade, Gordon's brigade, you have so many casualties there that you have staff members coming from Gordon's staff and so on down to basically replace company commanders. Because you see in 20th New York, you have a captain commanding the regiment, and you have sergeants and corporals commanding the companies. So they need these officers, and one instance of that is Captain Robert Gouldshaw, who became colonel shortly thereafter of the 54th Massachusetts. But he was he had been a captain in the 2nd Massachusetts, and he was at Winchester, moved to Gordon's staff, and then back down to company command for Antietam. But basically caused a lot of problems with coordination, right? Because you don't have, none of these brigade commanders had staffs for the most part. Gordon had some congressmen volunteer to be a staffer as they moved through D.C. All right. So what happens after the battle is Jackson, after 2 days, there's a truce. The Union come in for the wounded. While they're doing that, Jackson pulls away, gets himself back across the Rapidan, and the rest of Pope's army comes down here, and there's a standoff across the Rapidan like nothing ever happened. And then a few days later, when it's become apparent to Robert E. Lee that McClellan is leaving the peninsula, Lee disengages from the peninsula and comes over and joins Jackson. He wants to get at Pope in between the Rapidan and the Rappahannock. That's his first goal. On the 17th, some intelligence is gathered by Pope's cavalry, actually John Buford, and it tells him, okay, it's time to get back across the Rappahannock. And he does that, much to Lee's chagrin. So you have this really important period between the 20th and the 25th. I'm not going to talk about the whole thing, but I'll give you some detail in 20 seconds. It's kind of interesting. So each commander has a tactical problem. Pope's problem, well, let's talk about Lee first. Lee's problem is that he needs to get across the river, this side of the Bull Run Mountains, and come to grips with Pope. And he needs to find an open ford to do that. Pope needs to prevent that from happening, but also maintain contact both downriver and up this Orange and Alexandria Railroad, because he's got reinforcements and supply coming from those places. And so what Lee does is he kind of sidles very skillfully upriver, and that stretches Pope out, and he kind of goes back and forth about what to do. All right, so on the 22nd, one interesting detail is, I'll just kind of gloss over this, but Gordon gets put under arrest that morning for Pope figured out he gave information to an AP reporter, and that he was back in command by the afternoon though. And they move up here to Beverly Ford. Jackson is moving upriver after failing to find fords up until this point. He finds one up here. While Jubal Early's brigade and the 13th Georgia are crossing the river, there's this battle going on down here because the 12th Corps, or excuse me, 2nd Corps of Virginia is following Sigel's Corps, and Sigel's probing this river, and Henry Boland's brigade gets mauled by Trimble's brigade and Hood's brigade, and kind of like Ball's Bluff, and they end up going back across the river, people getting shot in the river, all that sort of thing. Right as that's finishing up, a freshet breaks over the Rappahannock River Valley, and the river rises 18 feet, and Jubal Early is trapped on the wrong side of the river. And that goes on for 2 days, where the Federals are trying to find him unsuccessfully, ultimately, and he skillfully moves around, kind of engaging with his artillery and keeping under cover to make himself appear bigger than he is. And one of the few times Stonewall Jackson seems kind of nervous, because he's sitting his horse in the river all day on the 23rd, watching AP Hill's engineers rebuild a bridge that was washed away. The same day, Jeb Stuart does his cavalry raid to Catlett Station, by the way. I'm going to go ahead and gloss over the 23rd, or skip over it, but Jubal Early gets back across the river. So you have this standoff just continue until the 25th. And that's when Stonewall Jackson begins his flank march that culminates in 2nd Manassas. And that's him going there. And in fact, it's that colonel from Banks' Corps that discovers that and gets the word to Pope. So increasingly, from the 25th onward until 2nd Manassas, the history of the 2nd Corps disengages from the rest of the army. Pope doesn't think they're capable of doing anything because they had such bad casualties at Cedar Mountain, and he thinks they need time away, basically. So here's their path. Right? There's a lot going on in this map. I think it's very, we call it punishingly intricate in my house, but it's probably my favorite one in the book. But you probably need some coffee and some time to look at it. Anyways, so Army of the Potomac started to show up. So the Second Corps is following Fitzjohn Porter's Corps up the railroad. They relieved them of their duty of guarding trains because Stonewall Jackson, when he got across, he destroyed 2 bridges at Kettle Run and Broad Run, and you had a bunch of trains with millions of dollars of property in them stranded. And Banks' Corps is now babysitting these trains while Second Manassas is happening up here. And right before we get to that, I just want to give you a couple quotes because the really important part of this period is the physical impact on these troops. And there's no, they all put their knapsacks in their wagons on the 19th of August, and they don't see them again until they get into Maryland in like the first week of September. And so they don't have a change of clothes, they really don't have anything. And there's no supply getting to them, and they're going days on end without eating. And all right, so from someone in the 10th Maine, the men are terribly jaded, literally half-starved and a great want of meat. We're dirty and becoming lousy again. This constant marching and counter-marching to no apparent purpose is aggravating in the extreme. An Indian in Gordon's brigade discovered, and there's nothing to be had here either because this region's already been fairly stripped clean, and then they're following Siegel. So anything that's left, Siegel's people are taking it. So there's really nothing for these guys to scavenge. And this Indiana private saw an abandoned knapsack in a wagon, and it had 2 bites of the grossest, fattest pork I ever saw, and also a small handful of moist, dirty cracker crumbs. But it was the sweetest morsel I ever ate. And there's no water available. Many of the men are getting dysentery and fevers. And from Pope, Banks' Corps is very weak, not amounting more than 5,000 men, and is much demoralized. And the Corps must be left somewhere in the rear to be set up again. And that's what happens here, Broad Run and Kettle Run. So, Second Manassas happens. Banks, and the men actually want to participate. Banks actually sends a message to Pope's staff asking, how important is it what we're doing here? Do you need us to come participate in this battle? And Henry Halleck from Washington actually answered and said, yes, go participate, unless you have positive orders otherwise. But then Pope's chief of staff, Colonel Ruggles, answered back, said, no, stay where you are. You've been told to stay there. And so it continues on until after the battle goes poorly, and Pope sends word to Banks to destroy all the railroad cars and to join them in Centerville. They're down here via Brentsville, right? So they're going to go out of their way and then march up here. The implication being that you have this, potentially they're cut off, and they need to kind of go out of the way to not be cut off. And so now you have this small corps to begin with that's been beaten up. They're too weak to participate in the battle with the rest of the army, but now you potentially have a victorious Confederate army in between the two. So, and what makes things worse is that word gets sent on the night of the 30th. The rider gets lost and doesn't show up until the morning of the 31st. So now you have another maybe dozen hours passing before they get there. So they set fire to the trains and they take off. The 2nd Massachusetts, this really professional regiment, is in the lead. They set a grueling pace, and there's no straggling though, because everybody realizes the kind of gravity of the situation. But horses collapse and are unharnessed and left to die on this march. It turns out to be sort of anticlimactic because no Confederates come this way, and they make it to Centerville more or less without incident. Tom Rosser's cavalry comes down to Manassas Junction and picks up a few people in Geary's brigade, but that's pretty much it. The Confederate infantry is going around the other flank, and that culminates in Chantilly on September 1st. So the next day, September 1st, they all start heading back towards Washington in retreat. This really interesting thing happens. Banks, John Clark actually gets a detachment from the 28th Pennsylvania, 17 infantrymen, enlisted men rather, and they head out behind enemy lines. I'm not going to get into the details here, but it's a really interesting episode. And they get actually on the wrong side of the Confederate army and have to make their way back with a bunch of Confederate prisoners. It's kind of fun. So that happens, and they're all making their way back. Chantilly happens on the 1st. They're standing on the road when that thunderstorm breaks, and they're standing there. That night, they're not allowed to light fires. So everybody's kind of cold and miserable the next morning when they start heading back this way. And they're waiting at this intersection of at Annandale, waiting for an Army of the Potomac unit to go past. And everybody's starting to get feel a little better. Okay, it's almost over. And then, as most things, when you think something's almost over and then it's not, then you're really kind of bummed out. A staffer for Banks comes up to Gordon and says, okay, you're going to take your brigade back to Fairfax and secure some government stores. And he asks, okay, do you mean Fairfax Station or Fairfax Courthouse? Because they're 6 miles away and 4 miles away from each other. And the staffer didn't know. Gordon went to Banks. Banks didn't know. He wouldn't let him out of the order. He said, well, I guess go to Fairfax Courthouse first and then go to Fairfax Station. It's not there. And the Confederates were thought to be there. And Jeb Stuart's cavalry was at Fairfax Courthouse. So they go back. Long story short, they eventually turn around and ignore the order. But everybody's completely demoralized by that. And by the time they get to the forts, they're pretty much done. And I'll give you a couple of quotes here to end this. So, a member of the 10th Maine wrote, "The men dropped as if they were shot. It is the darkest day and darkest hour in our regimental history." Wilder Dwight, Lieutenant Colonel of the 2nd Massachusetts, he wrote, "It has been so tense and corrosive that I am not yet in tune to write on account of it. Disaster, pitiable, humiliating, contemptible." And then an Ohio private wrote, "We suffered, but we have become inured to hardships," which, in my opinion, is really the great summary for this half of the book and leads into the second half, where they really do great things at Antietam that are kind of unexploited, but it's extra, it's extraordinary, actually, given what happened to them leading up to this. So, thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Now, I'm not going to read this to you, but this is a captain of the 102nd New York, and if anybody's ready to Herodotus, you'll probably find this funny. So, I'd be happy to answer any questions anybody has. Yes?